The Story of Aida and Saida from Palestinian Heritage. Written by Ibtisam Abu Mayaleh. Once upon a time, in an old village, there was a small girl, beautiful and kind in her dealings with the people of her village. She had a sweet voice, and everyone loved her, except for her stepmother and her stepsister, who lived with her in her father's house since he had been away for a long time. As the two girls grew up, Saida became even more beautiful, with a bright face, soft long hair, and a slender figure. Aida, on the other hand, always wore a frown and complained often, so people avoided her despite her beautiful hair and figure. Over time, Aida's frustration with Saida grew, and she complained to her mother daily. Her mother began to notice that people didn't like her daughter and that Saida was beloved by everyone. So she thought to herself and said, "I must get rid of Saida. I will send her to the ogress who lives at the top of the mountain, and the ogress will eat her without anyone knowing." Early the next morning, the stepmother called for Saida and said, "Saida, the flour sieve is missing. I need you to go to our neighbor, the ogress, who lives at the top of the mountain, and bring me the fine sieve. Do not return without it, no matter what." Saida replied, "All right, Auntie," and set off. She dressed neatly and combed her hair. As she walked, she greeted everyone she passed in her village, wishing them well. When she reached the mountain, she encountered villagers harvesting wheat. She greeted them, wished them luck, and asked if they needed her help. They blessed her and wished her success, praying that God would protect her from all harm. Feeling hopeful, Saida continued toward the ogress's house with a smile on her face. When she arrived, she knocked on the door, but no one answered. She knocked again and heard only the crying of a small child. Her heart softened at the sound, and she entered the house, calling out, "Auntie, Auntie," but no one answered. Saida began dusting, sweeping, and washing clothes. Then she noticed that the ogress's dough had risen, so she baked the bread and covered it with a clean cloth. She then sat and waited for the ogress to return. She looked around and saw the ogress's child crying, his clothes soaked. She hurried to him, comforting and soothing him until he smiled. She changed his clothes and combed his hair, then made him warm milk and fed him gently. After he was full, she made a swing for him and put him in it until he fell asleep. Then she turned to find the house in complete disarray. Feeling sorry for the ogress, she thought, "Poor neighbor, she has no time between caring for her child, doing the housework, and fetching kitchen supplies. Why don't I help her with some of the chores before she returns?" Moments later, the ogress appeared at the door, her face filled with anger. Who had dared to enter her home? She rushed to check on her child and found him sleeping in a beautiful swing, dressed in clean clothes. Her anger subsided as she saw that his wet clothes had been washed, dried, and folded, that her home had been tidied, and that the dough had been baked into bread. Everything was in perfect order. She looked at Saida and asked, "Who are you?" Saida smiled politely and replied, "My name is Saida, madam." The ogress murmured quietly and asked, "What do you want?" Saida replied, "I came to borrow your fine sieve, madam, if you please." The ogress, curious, asked, "Who sent you, little girl?" Saida answered, "My aunt, my father's wife, sent me. She told me not to return without the sieve. So please, madam, may I borrow it?" The ogress, surprised by Saida's kindness and politeness, asked, "Aren't you afraid of me?" Saida calmly replied, "No, madam." The ogress smiled faintly and said, "I will give you the sieve, but first, I want to tie you with a rope and lower you into this well. Do not be afraid. If you see white doves, open your eyes and look at them. But if you see black doves, close your eyes and do not look at them at all. Do you understand?" Saida nodded and said, "If that's what you wish, I will do it, madam." The ogress tied Saida with a rope and lowered her into the well. Inside, Saida saw the white doves flying gently around her. She smiled at them, saying, "How beautiful you are." When the black doves appeared, She closed her eyes as the ogress had instructed. Saida heard the well respond, "As you command, my lady." The ogress began pulling Saida up from the well. When Saida stood on her feet again, she looked like a mythical maiden. Her hair was adorned with pearls, her silk dress glittered with gold coins, and her sweet smile shone brighter than ever. The ogress handed Saida the fine sieve from a corner of the house and said, "Hurry home to your aunt, for the day is nearly over." Saida took the sieve and returned home, passing by the villagers who were still working in the wheat fields. She greeted them, and when they saw her, they rushed over to admire her newfound beauty and wealth. They asked her for some of the gold coins from her dress, and she generously agreed. As they plucked the coins, new ones appeared in their place. Saida then politely excused herself and hurried home. When she entered the house, her stepmother was shocked. How had the ogress not eaten her? And why did she look more beautiful than ever, dressed in a gown finer than any princess's? Furious, the stepmother demanded, "What happened? Tell me, where did you get all of this?" Saida told her everything, the ogress's kindness, and how she had given her all these gifts, along with the fine sieve. The stepmother, seething with envy, called for her daughter Aida and said, "Prepare yourself for tomorrow. You will go to the ogress's house and tell her that your mother wants to borrow the rough sieve, and take this fine sieve back to her." The next morning, the stepmother woke up to find Aida still asleep. She shook her awake, but Aida began grumbling and cursing. She snatched the sieve angrily, without washing her face or combing her hair, and stormed out of the house, complaining to herself along the way. Whenever someone from the village greeted her, she snapped at them, accusing them of being the cause of her miserable morning with their mere presence. As she climbed the mountain, she saw the villagers still harvesting wheat. She mocked them and their efforts, refusing to greet them. They ignored her, even though some women whispered among themselves, wanting to reprimand her for her bad manners. But they thought it was better to avoid her. When Aida arrived at the ogress's house, she knocked on the door. When no one answered, she entered and found the ogress's child crying. She yelled at him to be quiet and stop bothering her. Then she noticed the bread and ate it. When she realized that the ogress was taking too long, she tried to amuse herself by playing with the child's swing, but it broke. She then turned to the bread oven and began throwing wood and stones into it until it caught fire and was destroyed. She watched the flames without caring. When the ogress finally arrived, she saw her child still crying, his swing broken, chaos throughout the house, and her bread missing. She looked at Aida, who said loudly, "Are you the ogress? I'm not afraid of you. My mother sent me to tell you that she wants the rough sieve. Here's your fine sieve. Now lower me into the well quickly. I'm tired of waiting." The ogress, furious but understanding the girl's intentions, said, "Fine, come here. Let me tie you with the rope and lower you into the well. If you see white doves, close your eyes. But if you see black doves, open them." As the white doves flew by, Aida closed her eyes. When the black doves appeared, she opened her eyes wide. The ogress then chanted, "A well, keeper of secrets, give this girl a donkey's tail." Then the ogress pulled the girl and said to her, "Go back to your mother and tell her I don't have a rough sieve." Aida returned home, disappointed. She saw neither silk nor gold coins. When she reached her village, she found the people still busy with the harvest. They looked at her and asked, "What happened to you, Aida? Why is a donkey's tail stuck to you?" Aida screamed in horror. "A donkey's tail? Where?" And when she saw it, she cried out, pleading, "Please remove it. Please help me." People began to gather around her, pulling at the donkey's tail until it was removed. But to their shock, more donkey tails appeared all over her body. Every time they removed one, another tail would grow in its place. Frightened, they backed away from her and said, "Go back to your mother. It's better for both you and us." Aida ran toward her mother, bursting through the door in anger. When her mother saw her, she cried out, "Oh, my dear daughter, what has happened to you?" Aida began to tell her mother everything that had happened. Soon, the people in the village began talking about what had occurred. They spoke of how their village now had two girls, one they called the Lady of Gold, and the other they named the Lady of Tales. The story spread until it reached the prince of a neighboring town. He was charmed by the story of the kind girl and sought his father's permission to propose to her. His father agreed, and the prince set off towards Saida's village, asking for her until he arrived at her house. He dismounted his horse and asked to enter, along with some of his entourage. Then he asked for Saida's hand in marriage from her aunt. The aunt thought for a moment, then said cunningly, "I have conditions. If you agree to them, Saida will be yours." The prince replied, "Agreed. What are your conditions?" "First, the wedding will take place at my house and at night. Second, I want it to be a celebration without any lights, candles, or lanterns. Third, after the wedding, I want you to take your bride and not reveal her face until you are in your palace. I don't want you to see Saida until she is your wife and in your home." The prince said, "So be it." And so the festivities were announced, and the village rejoiced. But the resentful aunt dressed her daughter, Aida, in Saida's golden dress and seated her beside the prince. She found no place to hide Saida except in a large basket, which she covered. The prince couldn't see his bride, and the villagers couldn't distinguish her. However, a small cat that Saida had played with and fed earlier could smell Saida from inside the vegetable basket. The cat, with its keen night vision, saw that Aida was the one being escorted to the prince. It quickly jumped onto the prince's lap and began to meow, saying, "Meow, meow, the Lady of Gold is under the basket. Meow, meow, the Lady of Tales is beside the prince." The prince noticed the cat and tried to understand what it was saying, but the aunt hurried over and shooed the cat away, raising her voice in song to drown out the cat's cries. After a while, the cat returned, jumped back onto the prince's lap, and repeated, "Meow, meow, the Lady of Gold is under the basket. Meow, meow, the Lady of Tales is beside the prince." Again, the aunt tried to chase the cat away, but this time the prince grew suspicious. When the cat jumped into his lap for the third time and the aunt rushed to shoo it away, the prince caught the cat, stood up from his seat, and ordered everyone to be silent. He listened closely to the cat, which repeated, "Meow, meow, the Lady of Gold is under the basket. Meow, meow, the Lady of Tales is beside the prince." At that moment, the prince shouted to his men, "Light up the place." Immediately, large torches were lit, and the prince quickly unveiled his bride, only to find Aida with her scowling face and donkey tails dangling from various parts of her body, her shoulders, arms, and more. The prince shouted at the aunt, "What is this? Where is my bride?" His guards surrounded the aunt with their flaming torches, as if they intended to burn her. Terrified, the aunt pointed toward the basket and said, "She's there, she's there." The prince hurried to the basket and freed Saida. He was overjoyed to see her smiling face and clear eyes. Although he wanted to punish the aunt, he was pleased to see Saida interceding for her, asking for mercy. The villagers rejoiced at what had happened. They gathered around Saida, congratulating her and wishing her well as they bid her farewell, while she rode away with her prince on his beautiful horse. And so, they lived happily ever after.